thank you for writing this lovely book. It was informative, compelling, and I read it and was taking notes, and I was just like the whole time, like, yes, this is great, and learned so much. So my first question to kind of open up is, what inspired you to write this book? And I asked this because boarding house women have been on the periphery of other books, but never the center. And Southern boarding house women in particular are not talked about. It's the Midwest and Northeast, really. So why this book and what inspires you to write it?
Thank you. Yeah, that for me, I had been working for a while in the areas of Southern food studies. I've written about Appalachia, Western North Carolina, where I'm from. I've written about the wider South and how we use food to talk to each other, to remember things, to think about how our societies work, to enforce things about our society, to open up things. And this project actually started as a lot of really good things do in a conversation with some women that I am very fortunate to have in my life, a series of academic women, but also very kind women. We were at a conference. Academic conferences can sometimes be, think of your favorite professional conference. And then every once in a while, there is one that is just a brigadoon of conferences. And this was that kind. It actually was taking place down in Spartanburg and was co-sponsored by Converse College down there, which then later came around to be sort of an interesting part of the story. And one evening, we were sitting in the bed and breakfast where we were staying, actually, and having a conversation. And what happened in the conversation is I started thinking through the number of our earliest published Southern cookbooks and how many of the women who wrote them were actually boarding house keepers. And Hillary, you're exactly right. Like kind of on the fringes, very present. No one had really written about that. And I got really curious why that was the case. So Mary Randolph, whose cookbook, The Virginia Housewife, is really a representation of a system and plan that the women and men who are enslaved in her kitchens developed over time, and you can track in our archives how those women and men trained other people, and that plan sort of spreads out around the region. Melinda Russell, whose cookbook is the first one that we know of right now, published by a Black woman and a woman in the South. She actually was trained by someone from Mary Randolph's kitchen and plan, and she talks about how she modified that and made it a little better. She's right. That's fantastic. And then stretching forward, thinking about Craig Claiborne, who really revolutionized food criticism in the pages of the New York Times and kind of kicked off the Southern food revival in the 80s and carrying forward. His mother was a boarding house keeper. James Beard's mother, not in the South, but James Beard's mother also ran a boarding house. And I got really intrigued about why that might be the case. And so this really started there, and it started with that story of food. But then as so many other kinds of things happen when you're in the archives, I just started thinking about what else was made possible by the boarding house. What other things did women come together to create for themselves, or models that they built out of it? And so then I just kind of let the project run from there.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that comes in is the diversity of women. These were entrepreneurial women. They were innovators. And one of the things I was really struck by is how you organize this. It's not only the innovators in terms of food waste and cuisines, but industry. But each chapter, you pair women, and you pair a white woman and a Black woman, and show the role of race and these women across. It wasn't just one or the other, and how they reinforced there. So I was wondering why these women that you selected, because you could have selected more, and what compelled you to pair these women in this way that allowed you to really go into the project you wanted to do?
So I am always interested in the themes that emerge when we start with people's stories. And we let people tell the story the way they want to tell it, or the way that we can still find it. Sometimes our archives are a little bit fractured or broken. But I don't think that you can or should tell a story in the U.S. South about food without being really attentive to whose voices are present, whose have been erased, who was doing work, who was being served, who was serving, all those kind of questions. But the story of boarding houses then is a story of people, largely women of all races, of as many religions as were present in the South, of different classes, who were finding this model really flexible. And maybe we should stop on that for just a moment, because I will also tell you that I did not go into this project saying, well, if you didn't call yourself a boarding house keeper, and if you didn't have a boarding house that looked the way maybe we think of boarding houses today, if we think of boarding houses today, you all are going to walk out of this room thinking of boarding houses today. But if you didn't have your business organized in the way that we might most recognize it, I'm not going to count you. I don't find that interesting. I think most of us live our lives making our best, using structures that are available to us and then modifying them as we need to. So I came into the projects with a really flexible and open definition. And so part of what I was looking to do was to find stories and voices that really open up the themes of boarding houses.
Yeah, and I liked how you used the word flexible, and how you talk about and pair these various individuals within this flexible, open thing, because I came in reading thinking, this is a boarding house. This is how I think about boarding houses. They look like this, they function like this, but then you disrupted it. And caused me to think more broadly about this. So one of the things I would want to ask, because I asked about these women, why these women, who was your favorite woman to write about?
Oh, that's a mean question. I have to pick my favorite. I think, well, let me start with the story that surprised me the most. In previous books that I've worked on, I thought that I understood what my own standpoint was, what my pathway into the project was. I didn't actually think I had any connection to boarding houses. That didn't seem to be something that I thought I'm going to learn here. I'm going to find ones that were in communities where I grew up, but I don't have a personal connection. And then while I was doing the project, at one point I was looking at some of our census records, and I thought, well, what the heck? I should look for my family name. I should look and see. And what I found was my grandmother, who I had a family memory of my mom telling me that at one point, while the Augusta paper plant was being built in Transylvania County in North Carolina, my grandfather helped to build that plant, physically build that plant. And I remember my mom saying, oh, we lived it behind this kind of general store thing during that time. And I remember there being a lot of people in the house. And that was the sum total of the story. And we do also talk a lot about what my grandmother's cooking was like and how great she was at cooking for a crowd. You can see where I'm going with this, but it was a family story I literally did not know. So when I looked in the census records, what I found was that my grandmother had said to the census taker not only that she was a boarding house keeper, but that she had made almost as much money in the year as my grandfather had working at the plant. And given that our family story is that she was very shy and that she didn't think that she was a businesswoman, I thought, oh, these really are stories that are everywhere. But that's the personal answer.
But the personal is so important because I think it helps in the type of people you're talking about, the character and the fleshing out. So I'm still going to go back. So that was the personal. What was the favorite?
So I think the one that I found most fascinating over time is I sort of stumbled across the story of a girl named Lola Walker. And Lola was a young girl. She was really 17 or 18 when this story started. And there are things about the story we might never know, and I'm gonna proceed a little carefully on that because there are things that are disturbing in the story. But Lola came to Asheville to stay in her aunt's boarding house. And she had been in Chicago before. She had been in Galveston, Texas before. She had lost her parents quite young, and so it seemed to be this kind of series of aunts that were taking care of Lola. And I have a feeling that maybe they sent her to Asheville because they thought she maybe was starting to get into some trouble, and it didn't work. So she ended up in Asheville at her aunt's boarding house. She had a wild summer of drinking, of dancing on tables, of taking carriages out of town with men at night, one man at night, and eventually she runs away. And that's the moment that her aunt realizes how serious it is. Part of why I found this fascinating is that eventually later, I can tell you more of the story later, but her aunts sue on her behalf, and it goes to trial. And the man that has seduced her, the language of the day, says, "You'll never win. This is going to trial in Western Tennessee. It's where I'm from. He was a millionaire. I know all the judges. I know all the jurists." What is so fascinating about the story is that the entire ecosystem shows up on the stand. And it was one of those places where you get voices of all of the people who are coming in and out of that boarding house, traveling salespeople, the cook in the boarding house, another woman who was a companion to the aunt who was doing errands in the boarding house, the men who helped provide alcohol. That was taboo, but they're around the boarding house, and so you get Lola, you get the man and his friends. Hardest to research. His name was Dick Edwards. Can't Google that name. You can't find that name and find a grave. Or actually, you can. You just find hundreds of them, right? And so then you have to narrow it down. But what was so fascinating there is that the Nashville American sent someone to the trial. They do a daily story. The daily story gets picked up by the New York Times, by the Asheville newspapers, by the Texas newspapers, by the Chicago newspapers. And what you start to see is this network of boarding house keepers, of girls who are thinking about what they can do and who they can be. You get to really see the stakes of what does it mean to be in a boarding house but chafing against the expectations on you, and of course the stakes of an ill-advised, what Lola seems to think was a romance, and that really didn't prove to be that. So I offer that as one of those boarding house keepers and one of those boarding house stories that just opens up and opens up.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, too, you really hint on it in your answer is the ecosystem. Who's their networks, including who's supplying the food? How do people advertise? Where do they come into play? And how much that these individuals as keepers, boarding house keepers, had to navigate. Because so much contingent on other people that you really see them as innovative business people. And I liked how you talked about your grandmother making as much money as her husband at the time, because these women were making money. They were also employing a lot of people. So I was wondering if you can talk about what are they innovating as the profession that we would think of boarding houses, but also hospitality. And then I would go and then follow up cookbooks because they have to cook.
Yes, they do.
And I'm going to go back to your opening because their food, amazing.
Yeah, so let's jump around wildly in time just a little bit, which is something we can do this evening. One of the boarding house women that I really became so impressed by as I spent time with her story is a woman named Della McCullers. So when you research boarding houses, there's not there's not just one trail you go down. One of the places that a lot of boarding house stories live is in the Federal Writers Project papers. So during the Great Depression, the federal government sent a lot of writers out across the U.S. Most of them hang out in the South, right? And they are interviewers, black and white, and they have a charge to give us portraits of daily life in the U.S. And of course, they're traveling, and a lot of them end up staying in boarding houses. I kind of have a theory that they had a quota. You hadn't quite fit your quota, so then you end up talking to the people in your boarding house, and a lot of them are talking to boarding house keepers. So there is an interview in the Federal Writers Project papers. A man named Robert King interviews Della McCullers. So Della McCullers has her boarding house that's near Shaw University, and it's at the heart of that really incredibly vibrant neighborhood around Shaw at the time, the sort of heart of Black Raleigh during that time period. And Della is someone who has been a really accomplished restaurant owner. She had, Hillary, I'm sorry, I don't quite remember the number. I think she had a 16-table restaurant. I mean, it's a massive restaurant. That's a big restaurant for today, if you think of the restaurants that you go to. It was quite successful. It was very vibrant, but two things happen. One is the crash, and so the customers change. The second is that in the early 20th century South, we've got a couple of things. One is the federal rules that are about Pure Food and Drug Act, which is then encouraging much more spot checking of restaurants to see if they're hygienic, right? That's when we get the early, your number codes in restaurants. Is that 100%? Is it 80%? Is this a restaurant you can feel confident is safe? And we're during the heart of Jim Crow. And so McCullers is getting a lot of spot checks of her restaurant and a lot of fees to get the licenses that she needs to run the restaurant. I suspect that the way downtown Raleigh is working, she probably got more of those than some of the other restaurant owners in town, particularly white restaurant owners. But she's also facing this kind of crash and a change of the cash that employees might have. So part of why she is so impressive is that she shuts down that restaurant and she opens up what she calls a boarding house. That is an example of one that's not perhaps really a boarding house. It's got some cots. She's got some family members. It's clear some people stay there every once in a while. It's really a community center. It's really, she's got jukeboxes. She's got decorations on the walls. She's got food that she is tailoring to her customers. Are you employed today and you need a lot of calories to get you through the day? Are you not and you need less, but in fact you need some coffee and you need a place to stay and you need a place to kind of get warm? I mean, it's clearly a place that's functioning on a lot of levels and is successful enough that she's supporting herself, family members, a grandson. You can trace her family through the record, and they're one of those quintessential examples of families that took advantage of the Great Migration. Her daughters end up in D.C. and government jobs in D.C., which is in fact where she later dies. They're able to take care of her there. But the innovation that she's doing is first she's figuring out the system she's in. She's figuring out how to work in it. You can see that Robert King goes back a couple of times. Yeah. He likes it. Her food is amazing. She's really economical in her food, but flavorful in her food. So she's thinking through that. And she's starting to really think hard about what does it mean to serve Southern food? What does it mean to serve lunch? What does this look like as the ethnic makeup of Raleigh changes? She's getting a lot of competition from Greek restaurateurs, from folks who have opened up new hot dog stands, from the kind of pressure on her business. And you just watch her innovate over time.
Can I just add she's also fighting the law.
Absolutely.
And what does that mean to navigate those legal spaces? So I liked her ingenuity. She's like, okay, I'm not going to do a restaurant. I'm just going to do a boarding house. Wink, wink, come on over. And I think that's one. The other thing is, too, the law and how she's able to be flexible in doing that is so much of innovation. What happens when the law intrudes? And something about boarding house you have, that's always a threat. Like, do you get your licenses? Do you have are you going to get raided? Are you going to have this? Are you going to have the bad border? Mm-hmm. and that these women are navigating, but yet bringing these different innovations and different ways to survive and persist. And I'm glad you brought Della, because she was one of my favorite women that I read about, as well as some of the other ones of more Western North Carolina. So one of the things I was going to just ask about, another thing, so note to self, I'm a Civil War era historian. So for me, the Civil War Reconstruction is such an important take. And so one of the chapters talks about two women of the Civil War era.
Who would have hated each other, despised each other.
Diametrically opposed. One woman, Mary Pleasant, out in Southern California, abolitionist, fighting for freedom. The other one will be contributing to Lincoln's assassination. What does this mean that not only are these women operating these spaces, but they're operating political salons for the issues of the day? And I was wondering if you can talk about how women are using these spaces, whereas these women or other ones, to talk politics in Southern politics in the Jim Crow era, but also before the 19th Amendment. They are very political. So what is it about the boarding houses and these spaces that allow for these type of salons to happen?
Yeah, so it is one, I'm interested in what you think also, because you've looked at some of these spaces too. So let me start, and then you tell me what you think on that. So I do think that one of the things that can happen in a boarding house, particularly as with a woman who is thinking through what kind of clientele do I want? Do I want to advertise? Do I not? Do I want people who agree? Do I want, what's the kind of class of the people? Where am I locating my boarding house? Absolutely. So before the 19th Amendment, and then before, we got real and realized that not everybody was able to vote after the 19th Amendment. So extending on also, women who are very politically active wanted to have a political voice, could use the boarding house to do that even before they were formally able to. So I thought it was important to think about that, but think about it broadly. So not just politics that we might expect, but also politics that we might not expect, or people who indeed would not necessarily have agreed with each other. So, and Mary Ellen Pleasant and Mary Surratt used their boarding houses slightly differently also. So Mary Ellen Pleasant, for folks who haven't run across her, she was one of the first millionaires in California. She was an incredibly sophisticated businesswoman. She arrived in California right around the moment of the gold rush. She began with working as a cook and in boarding houses. She realized what a market there was for laundry, so she ends up owning a series of laundries. Then she moves to becoming her having her own series of boarding houses, most of which were really catering to the political elite in San Francisco at the time. And she really traded on, you can tell your secrets here, we'll keep your secrets here, you can talk about anything you want to. And she then uses her profits from boarding houses to support the abolitionist causes that she really cared about. So she and her husband were on the original charter for Canada West, which was one of the endpoints of the Underground Railroad. She sends money back. She helps to finance some of the earliest cases in San Francisco about integrating streetcars, things like that. Just a footnote on Mary Ellen Pleasant. You might be thinking, what in the world, California? The word Southern is here. Mary Ellen Pleasant, when she lands in California, because of her physical presentation, people looked at her and said, "Oh, she must be a good Southern cook." That was because she was a black woman. That was not necessarily true at all. She was not Southern. She grew up primarily in Nova Scotia. She had worked in shops, so she was a businesswoman, but she really hadn't worked as a cook. She had not worked she may have done laundry in the house that she grew up with, just as part of the other people that she was there in the house with, but that wasn't a formal part of her training. So I imagine, she had some select words when people started making that assumption, but it is also the case that she thought, well, I can work with that. This assumption, this idea of the South had traveled, and she took advantage of that and then used it to help found a South that she wanted to see, right? To help found a United States that she wanted to see. That was part of Mary Randolph's version also. That was also part of just one boarding house keeper we haven't talked about, but might be, if you think of the most famous literary boarding house keeper, you might think of Thomas Wolfe's mother and the portrait of her in Look Homeward Angel. Thomas Wolfe's actual mother, unlike the fictional portrait, she too was really trying to think about what kind of conversations could take place in this boarding house, because we're talking about politics, we're talking about the conversations that could be fostered. So Julia Wolfe had just in her stable, on her rotation, if she thought, oh, I'm going to have really literary types in my boarding house, she had some writers she would call up and say, hey, come sit in my parlor this evening. We need to have a more sophisticated conversation than I have time to have or I want to have. If she had politicians in the boarding house, she would think about, how can I make sure that that's a good conversation to have? So it was just a space where women who were interested in that could really have a say.
Yeah, and the way I look at boarding houses and why Mary Ellen Pleasance was so fascinating is through the colored convention movement. And these conventions that are debating free African Americans in the United States on the eve of the Civil War, but also after the Civil War. What does citizenship look like when you're in the free North, but you're a second-class citizen? What are our rights? But one of the things that fascinates me about this, these are conventions that are over 1,000 people traveling by train. Where do they eat? Where do they stay? But where do they continue that conversation after the convention meeting? So I always think about these spaces and the conversations not recorded, but these spaces and the conversations facilitated. And they tend to be in eating houses and boarding houses. So these gathering spaces of ideas and talking about the politics of the day, but just everything else, including, I can imagine, talking about food. How did you prepare this? But the boarding houses and the boarding house women I usually encounter are usually on the railroad circuit, connecting these different kind of conventions that happen and that then go into church conventions and school conventions. So really think about Black women doing these spaces because it was a safe job, but also one that they controlled. But those conversations that can be had, and that's something I think our experiences are very similar. These are spaces that probably brings people together that would never have been brought together before. But they're sharing a space, sometimes a table together, but also a savvy hostess who knows how to keep her clientele satisfied that they will not flee. So can you talk about the hosting skills of these women, whether it's politics, but the hostesses too?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you even see some women who are clearly thinking through, do I know how to do this? If I really want to, right? There's one model that is, hey, I am renting this house, or I own this house. I've got a little extra space, or I'm in a resort town or a vacation town. Maybe I can just have my kids sleep out back for the summer, or send them off to, my sister's house or whatever that might be, and I could take in some boarders. And then you see some women saying, oh, well, that was kind of interesting. This might be a way to support myself, my children, my found family, the people that I want to support. And in some of those women's records, you start to see them thinking through, okay, I might be able to figure out the food. I have some innate knowledge about how you do the laundry. I can set up this space, but that's not enough. It's also about catering to the people who come here. It's about creating those conversations. It's about thinking through what can be said and how it can be said. So you see some women, actually Julia Wolfe is an example of it, who when she thinks, oh, Asheville's about to grow, I can make some money off of this, but first there's this big World's Fair that's about to happen. And the colored conventions are also that kind of phenomenon, right? There's this big event. I know a lot of people from here are going to go there. I'm going to go there and rent a house. And I'm going to advertise to people that I know in my home community. And they might want to stay with me. And she does that, and she figures out, really, when she comes back to Asheville, she has a lot more knowledge about how to make that work. And she is indeed, like, near the train lines. She's near the fair. She's figuring out, oh, this could be a good place to do that. And so you see either people who are thinking through, I want to create this hospitality, or maybe I don't have any other way to attend this big things that's happening in my town, in my place. This would be a way that I could. And so what that hospitality looks like, it's widely varied, right? We've been talking a little bit about that literary or that political way of thinking through the conversations that happen in Boardinghouse. Let's be clear, in some of them, the line between a boarding house and a brothel is not that wide, right? So hospitality might also be something very different on offer. But that too could be a way for women to stabilize their own income, figure out how to use the spaces that they have. I went a little broad from hospitality.
But it works. So our last questions, I know we have questions in the audience, is where do you see the contemporary boarding houses operators today?
I had a little fun with that, and I'm interested in what folks in the audience or who are watching this think as well. Actually, let me be serious about that and make that invitation. One of the things I love about the things that we get to do about writing books is that it's the beginning of a series of conversations. And so I very much hope that when we open this up, you will tell me your stories, you will ask questions, but I also hope you'll find me and tell me your stories of boarding houses or of early restaurant workers who really are parts of boarding houses, cookbooks that you've seen used, et cetera. But then I started thinking about, where did boarding houses go? And, I started that story with sitting at a bed and breakfast and having a conversation. I don't actually think that that is the place to look for the legacy of boarding house keepers. Some, for sure, but the story in the U.S. South is that we didn't have a lot of purpose-built buildings. And ones that we had, they last longer than they do. Boarding houses and boarding house culture lasts longer in the U.S. South than in other parts of the country. In part, that is Jim Crow. That is, I'm from Hendersonville, North Carolina, and one of the things I discovered over the course of this project was that there was a moment in the early 20th century where there were 5 Jewish boarding houses in Henderson County. That's because of the summer camps there. People needed to stay overnight when they were dropping their kids off. You see these, they continue on. But rather than the bed and breakfast, which also has a lot to do with the bicentennial, right? A lot to do with our kind of national moment in the 70s of thinking about that legacy. I think it's actually the spirit of the boarding house keepers that are their real legacy. Part is this innovation in business that we've been talking about. At its core, a boarding house was a business model that you couldn't walk into a bank and say, hey, I have this idea, will you fund me, right? It was before there was, things like startup. It was before there was, this is a formal business. It was making a way out of what you already had. So I think we should look to things like Airbnb and VRBO and my students who all have side hustles. They might have an Etsy shop. They might be thinking about monetizing some of their social media. All of that is, hey, I'm going to make a way out of something that I can already do. And then we have to look around at things like our assisted living facilities. Early in the story of boarding houses, if you didn't have a family and you were facing a serious illness, you may well have just ended up in a boarding house and hoped that you found one with some nursing care, with someone who would be kind to you. We've really formalized that in our assisted living structures in the U.S. We've split it off a little bit, who does what, but it's still basically that model. You might need help with laundry. You might need some communal meals. We have done that structure around our colleges and universities. There's a long story of that Hillary and I were talking about before we came together, but also even today's sorority houses, fraternity houses, affinity houses may well have collective meals, may well have a kind of formalized way for people to live together collectively. Our homes that are about recovery are often on this model. And we may have some restaurant professionals in the room. It is certainly the case that our restaurants today, a lot of the staff in restaurants can be more recently immigrated folks who tend to then live together collectively while they're getting launched in the United States. All those places are spirits of boarding houses. How can we take what we have and what we know how to do? How can we do it collectively and benefit from each other? And how can we support ourselves?
And with that lovely answer, I want to open it up to the floor because I think it's definitely you captured the end in what this book is, that spirit that lives on. So anyone who wants to ask any questions?
I'm really interested in what depth you might be able to go into about the TB era in Asheville, because there were like 500 TB cottages there, and I'd just love to know what you could add to that discussion.
Oh, what a great question. So indeed, Asheville, Chattanooga had a lot of these, right, up over in Tennessee, as tuberculosis was really ravaging throughout the country. Really post-Civil War era, right, and into the 19-teens and 20s. One of my favorite Appalachian writers, a woman named Emma Bell Miles, died of TB, and she was at one of those, she was at the kind of sanitarium where they just stuck you on a cot outside under the theory that maybe some nice cold air would make you better. And didn't really work, but they gave it a go. And indeed, Asheville had a lot of tuberculosis treatment centers, clinics, and indeed cottages. I would connect that to that moment in the United States where vacationing was really invented also. So towns like Asheville that had a combination of good weather, beautiful sights, and beautiful vistas, plus good transportation, right? Particularly Asheville in the early 20th century, there was a lot of railroad, there were a lot of trains coming in, you could get there, increasingly by cars. I don't know a lot of how the clinics were advertised, but in the Southern Historical Collection at Chapel Hill, there are pamphlets of boarding houses and of places to stay in Asheville. And you do see some hints. Some of them are clearly, hey, healing air, right? And they're nodding to it. Now, stakes are high for boarding house keepers about whether they want their boarding house to be known as a place where there are sick people. Because, of course, some people didn't want to be in that place. But in Asheville, you could sort of pitch it as this is a place to recover, so the stakes weren't quite as high as they might be in other places. Flat Rock, near Asheville, right over in Henderson County, was definitely a place where there was a lot of summer migration by people of means from the coastal areas of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, up into the mountains to escape things like yellow fever, not as much tuberculosis, but still that sort of sense that there would be healing. Have you run across some of those facilities?
Largely in the mountains of Flat Rock in different areas, but it's kind of hard to see why they're going up. Is it a vacationing crowd or is it sickness or a combination of both? Mm-hmm. But Flat Rock in particular and Asheville, but just the mountains in general, that area.
Do you have a story that you didn't tell us in that question?
I had a great aunt who, the teeny cottage where she died, actually, in Asheville is now B&B. Here, it's not an Airbnb, but a B&B. Mm-hmm. It's on Oakland Street, and it was called Oakland Cottage. And Asheville was very opportunistic. They were in hard times after the Depression hit hard in Asheville. And so, the marketing geniuses, there was a Swiss doctor who said at a certain elevation, the air is pure and blah, 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 blah. And Asheville met all the criteria that he outlined. And so there was actually, in the day you would have thought it was a magazine. It was called Mountains of Health. I've seen these magazines. And it's all advertising tuberculosis-free cows and the purity of the water and the Sylvan filtration system of the mountains and on and on and on. And there's a lot of racist stuff in there too. Good colored cooks for $5 a week. And I mean, it was just a little snapshot of time, which is why I'm so interested in reading your book, because I took a deep dive into that in Asheville, in the what's it called, the Buncombe County room or whatever it is. They have a big TV collection, and so I took a deep dive there. But my aunt died there in the 40s, so it was still going then. And as you said, it wasn't always advertised overtly for TV patients, but there were those that definitely courted those patients. And that's one of the reasons that Asheville has such a robust, thoracic medical reputation around the country. Same with Arizona was like that too. And places in Colorado, like Colorado has a Jewish hospital that does a lot of thoracic, I can't say the word, but anyway, a lot of lungs procedures and such.
Well, that's right. We started this conversation with Melinda Russell, and maybe we could just duck back to her for just a moment. So her cookbook is published in 1866, so earlier than we're talking about right now, but it is published in Michigan because she has had to flee eastern Tennessee. She was a free black woman, and it just got too politically dicey there, right? I'm underplaying that. It got much too violent. She and her family were quite threatened. And in fact, she had a son who we don't know exactly in what way, but was in some way physically disabled. And so I think she was quite worried about him. So she flees to Michigan and she publishes her cookbook in Michigan, but it's based in part on the boarding house that she ran in a place called Cold Springs, Tennessee. We don't actually know precisely where that boarding house was. It's one of the kind of mysteries in the archive. We don't know that much about Melinda Russell, but we do know that in part she was catering to people who wanted to have that kind of, there's hot springs, there's warm springs, there's cold springs, right? Taking the waters was part of what she was offering.
I'm curious about the reputation of the keepers. To me, it just sounds exhausting, but you're also making it sound like they're proud of their work. I didn't know what kind of reputation they had in the community or if that just depended.
Yeah, such a good question. Such a huge range, right? So certainly some boarding houses that were very, that might cater to wealthy families whose girls or even sons needed a place to stay where their reputation would be intact, where they might get some kind of etiquette or manners that, all those things might happen. There'd be a curfew, there would be, all those sort of structures. Others that are, on top of your bar, near the train station, down near the docks, ones where reputation was really not what was front of mind for people. Interestingly, something we didn't touch on that I got really fascinated by is the way then that people could use that question of reputation for their best interest, for what they wanted to do. So there are examples of people who present themselves at boarding houses as being of a class that they aren't, but if they are successful pulling that off, they might move to the next boarding house and be accepted as, you've got some examples, in fact, of former brothel owners who do that. They had a lot of cash, but they weren't necessarily accepted as of a higher class, right? The way social class works in the United States. But if you go to a boarding house and you pull that off, people who were passing in terms of their race, people who used boarding houses as a way to not marry if they weren't interested in heterosexual marriage, people who introduce themselves in a boarding house with the gender identity that they most identify with. And we have some kind of just crumbs in the archives of people who almost pull that off, which then suggests there's a lot of people who do pull that off. So that question of reputation is such a fascinating one. Boarding houses could be very strict. They could be very about enforcing social structures and power. That could be used to your advantage if you wanted to, or you could subvert it. And I think it's really interesting that boarding houses allow people to move around both in the world and for themselves.
Thank you so much to both of you. This has been really exciting and inspiring. I would be remiss, because I work at Levine, if I didn't ask you a question about Charlotte in the course of your research and what interesting things one can learn kind of about Charlotte from the vantage point of boarding houses and boarding house women.
I love that question. Yes, let's come into Charlotte. You all are going to tell me stories also, but let's start with the historical plaque for Carson McCullers, which notes that she wrote the first draft of The Heart is a Lonely Hunter in a boarding house here in Charlotte. And in fact, I take a moment toward the end of the book to think about how I sort of do a riff on Virginia Woolf's Room of Her Own, because in fact, you find a lot of authors, particularly female authors, using boarding houses as a place to lift from that kind of daily care and daily life and be able to find their creative voice, write their story. Carson McCullers is one of those people. And then, boarding houses in the U.S. South, we certainly think of ones that were associated with factories, as we had, both textile factories, furniture factories, right? All those industries in North Carolina, they have boarding houses associated with them. But in a city like Charlotte, there is also boarding houses who are supporting that growth of white collar, pink collar, industries. And indeed, across the U.S. South, you find cities like Charlotte maintaining boarding houses for a long period of time because you have people who are maybe at their first job or maybe are have a traveling job. And a boarding house is a really useful thing to have access to. And there's some folks who just decide, you know what, this is a pretty good deal. I'm really happy with this arrangement. And they stay in boarding houses for a long time.
I want to thank you for your questions and thoughtfulness in talking about this book. And I want to thank everyone for coming out this evening and to our host for this tonight. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the table in the corner of the room. Books of copies of Boarding House Women that we've been talking about are available for purchase, and our author will be able to sign those. So can we give a round of applause to our author for this show?